Welcome back. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to use CSS transitions with transforms. CSS transforms allow elements styled with CSS to be transformed in two-dimensional or three-dimensional space. So transforms come in very handy for creating transitions and animations. Let's take a look at the HTML file. Here I have a styles.css file linked up as an external file. And inside of the body, I have a div with an ID of box, and inside of that, I have an image that contains the image of a bird with an ID of bird, and you can take a look at the CSS for that. The styles for the box are basically just to center it on the stage, and the bird is positioned absolutely within that box, and you can take a look at that here. Here it is in the browser. Okay, now the first thing I want to show you is the trigger state for our transition, and I already have that set up below where this says box hover. So when you hover over the box, it's going to affect the bird element within that box. So let's start out by showing you the first transform. So the transform translate is how we can animate on the X and Y axis, or the up and down, left and right axis. And this is the default value 0, 0. So we could say animate the X axis to 100 pixels. Let's see what that looks like on hover. And we can also use negative values. So on the Y axis, the up and down axis, I can say, we'll just say minus 50 pixels. Okay, now to set up our animation, we'll add the transition property, and we'll say transition, and here we could say transform, or we could also say the all keyword, which means animate any CSS property that is different between the initial state and the hover state. So let's just leave that as all for now. And then we'll say, we'll just do this for 1 second. We'll take a look at that. And you can see it's a nice ease in and out for that transform. Okay, another thing I should point out is that for transforms, you want to use the browser prefixes because it's implemented different for different browsers. So you'd actually want to copy this 3 times. And for WebKit browsers, this syntax is -WebKit-. And for Microsoft, and this is for IE9, you'd say ms-. Transform works in all modern browsers, and in Internet Explorer it works in version 9 and above. So I'm just going to leave these out for now, because transform works just fine in Chrome, which I'm using here, and it's just easier to follow along as I'm teaching. Alright, now notice that I didn't have to set a transform translate state for our initial state here, and that's because it defaults to 0, 0. So if I added it like this, it would work the same. But if we wanted to start that translate at a different value, we would want to add that here. The next one I want to show you is rotate. That looks like this. And you set the degrees. So we can start this out at 45 degrees. So this is our beginning state. And for our end state, let's set that to a -45. Take a look at that. And you can set a transform origin on this if you don't want it to rotate from the center. And the default is 50%, 50%. So we could say 0, and that will rotate off the left side, or 100 will rotate off the right side. The same with the second property, 0 will be the top and 100 will be the bottom. The next one I can show you is transform scale. And the default is 1. And let's just scale that to 1.5 times. Take a look at that. We could set the default to a small value. The next thing I'll show you is a 3D transform. So we can rotate along the X and Y axis. We can say rotate X and set a degree. Set that to 0, which is the default. And a rotate Y as well. And for the end state, we'll say rotate X. We'll do 180 degrees. We can see what that looks like for the rotate Y. Or if we combine those. We could also do 360 degrees. Now if you notice, let me bring this back to 90. The rotation just looks like we're squishing the image together. So we want to put some perspective on this. What you want to do is you can set a transform perspective, and you want to do that on a parent element. So let's set that on the body. And we can say set this to 600 pixels and test that out. Actually, before we do that, we also need to set the transform style. And you need to set this to preserve 3D. And we can take a look. This will be a little more apparent if we add a border to the bird image. There you can see that perspective. Or if we take that out, you can see there is no perspective. And this value inside the transform perspective, the lower the value, the more dramatic that perspective is. So if we set it to 200, you can see it's a much more dramatic perspective. Or if we set it to 1000, it's just a very slight. I can see what that looks like if we make a full rotation. Make that dramatic again. And there's no limit to how many times you could rotate. We could do this twice, 2 rotations, or slow that down so you can see it better. And note that this first initial transform, rotate X, rotate Y, as it is now, I could delete it and it's going to work just the same, and that's because we have the default value set in there. But if we wanted to start out with a different default value, we could do that. So let's try 45 degrees on both, and then the end state will do a minus 45 degrees. Let's speed that up a little. And there's no limit to how many transforms you can string together, so we could also scale this as we rotate it. So there's a lot of fun things you can do with transforms in a transition, and by combining transform properties you can get some pretty interesting effects. In later lessons, I'll show you the CSS animation property, which is similar in ways to transition, but in other ways you'll have greater control of the animation. Thanks for joining.